Ed, and I worked for nearly 30 years as an international rep and organizer for the communication workers in the Northeast. I know we've just done a bit of union bureaucrat bashing, but
oh, don't go soft on a snail.
I thought I would start by calling out or outing a few of my fellow bureaucrats who are actually exemplary leaders in the room, because we have a wealth of experience here that we want to draw on in the discussion. I'd particularly like to recognize Sister Judy Sheridan Gonzalez, recently elected a statewide.
I'm not a bureaucrat. I'm not paid.
I just shifted from bureaucrats to leaders, to exemplary leaders. Newly elected Vice President of NYSNA. Brother Sal Roselli, as many of you know, is a former member of the National Executive Board of SEIU, 20-year president of its third largest local, former head of its state council in California, and now one of the founders of the new National Union of Healthcare Workers. Brother Tim Schimmerhorn, who was recognized earlier, was a vice president of Transit Workers Local 100, another major public employer union. Any other labor leaders in the room? Anybody willing to be recognized as such, elected leaders? Paul? Yes, over here.
I was twice elected as an open communist to be a vice chair in the track division of New York City Subway Transport Workers Union Local 100. A public revolutionary transit worker.
Good to see you. Yeah.
Chuck Slackton. I'm elected as the legislative and political director of the New York Metro Area Postal Union.
Okay. Yeah.
Angel Gonzalez, but I'm grassroots, never elected to any executive body, or to see the rank and file as the leadership and the new Superman person for the leadership.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, Brother John?
Past President, Machinist Local 1145.
Anybody else? Yes, this is
leader. Please.
Billy.
All right, so we have a number of real leaders in the room, none of whom I'm sure would think of themselves as conservative bureaucrats. I, got interested in this question of what the challenges of union leadership, interviewing a lot of folks for this new book, The Civil Wars in U.S. Labor, that Haymarket was good enough to bring out. And it particularly focuses on the generational cohort of labor leaders who came out of the 60s and the 70s, social movements, the civil rights movement, the student movement, the women's movement, the black power movement. People with 30, 40 years ago went into the labor movement with an agenda, a project for shaking it up, for changing it, for reforming it, for radicalizing workers, building revolutionary parties. And the book looks at the careers of a number of folks out of that generational cohort: Brother Sal, Roseanne DeMauro, the leader of the California Nurses, Andy Stern, who was mentioned earlier, John Wilhelm, Bruce Rayner, wonderful Puerto Rican teachers union leader, Rafael Feliciano Hernandez, who's here speaking at several panels, and tries to grapple with the question, how did these folks who started out more or less on the same side of the barricades back in the 60s and 70s end up on opposite sides of the barricades in some of the recent inter- and intra-union conflicts on the progressive wing of the labor movement here in North America and in Puerto Rico. To paraphrase, Pogo in a famous cartoon from the Vietnam era, we have met the enemy, and it's us, or at least some of us. I mean, that literally has been the experience of the last few years. What are some of the factors or influences that lead people in a bad direction as leaders in unions, and contribute to some of the organizational dysfunction and misbehavior? I want to second just about everything that Mark said and Sheila said. I have a few disagreements with Josh that are expressed in the book, but to run through a very quick checklist. One factor that everybody in this room who's done trade union work certainly wouldn't discount is just the impact over years or decades of the day-to-day demands of the job. I mean, for 27 years, I never had the pressure of being an elected officer, but I was involved in contract negotiations, strikes, organizing campaigns, handling grievances, doing arbitration cases. It wears people down. I mean, the burdens are enormous. The labor movement's in retreat. Whatever your politics, whatever dreams or ambitions you once had about contributing to a labor upsurge, an awful lot of people are spending most of their time in very nitty-gritty and difficult and time-consuming and draining and stressful defensive battles. And that's their job. That's what they're elected to do. That's what they're appointed to do. And it's all-consuming. And I've seen an enormous number of people of goodwill, people with good politics, just burn out over time and become cynical and depressed and personally dysfunctional, and that contributes to the problems of union culture that are maybe non-structural. It also contributes to this, pragmatism that is so widespread, which on some issues becomes almost like crackpot realism, right? I mean, people just lower their sights, lower their expectations, and unfortunately don't convey to the workers they represent very often much of a sense of optimism or hope or the ability to do better than we're doing right now. As labor critics, Kim Moody is here, C. Wright Mills weighed in on this with New Men of Power, Stanley Aronowitz was another observer who noted that when you move from the shop floor, whether it's a white-collar or blue-collar shop floor, to a full-time union position, appointed or elected, something changes, right? A lot changes. You have a new peer group, you're relating to employer representatives, and you're relating to public officials and politicians, you're dealing with mediators and arbitrators and lawyers, then you go to Central Labor Council meetings and you're, partying with fellow bureaucrats. You're no longer rooted in the rank and file the way that you perhaps were when you were a shop committee person or a militant steward or a member of a local bargaining committee. And that, change in people's work setting over time, kind of influences their outlook. This is not a revelation or a unique insight, but you've definitely seen the impact of it on the generational cohort of the 60s and 70s. The two-party politics people have mentioned, it's part of the crackpot realism. People get very involved in the Democratic Party at the national level. They get on the Democratic National Committee. They get invited to fundraisers. They are big donors. It makes them feel important. No matter how disappointing the Democrats are, inside the Beltway, top labor leaders, with a few honorable exceptions, Roseanne DeMauro lately being one of them, rhetorically, are very wedded to these personal, political, financial relationships with the Democratic Party, as we know. Josh mentioned nepotism. I think the bigger problem is the labor movement is still this terrible gerontocracy, right? I mean, Brother Andy Stern, I will give him one thing, he left at a decent age, 60. Right? But this labor movement is so overaged that when Change to Win was launched in 2005, remember, it was depicted in the mainstream press and the business press as a revolt of the Young Turks. Who are the Young Turks? Bruce Rayner, Andy Stern, John Wilhelm, all average age 59, 60. I mean, if these are Young Turks, what kind of movement do we have, right? An overage one. 3/4 of all union members are over the age of 35. The age of people in top leadership, it's off the charts. Louie Roberts, the head of the biggest AFSCME district council in the country. She won't even tell us what her age is. She's so far up in her 80s. Jerry McEntee, not far behind her. He won't leave. My old union, Morty Barr, stayed on till he was 77, 78, left my friend Larry Cohn waiting in the wings, Prince Charles-like, for 10 years while the union went to hell in a handbasket. Rich Trumka, same thing with Sweeney, didn't leave when he was supposed to, was left, waiting for 10 years. He takes over at age 60. Hey, man, he's not going to leave until he's as old as Sweeney was when he left. So this thing perpetuates itself. It's a very serious problem in terms of the face of the labor movement presented, how long it takes people to reach to these top level positions, and we just we need mandatory retirement ages. We need term limits. In other countries, it's unacceptable. As many problems as they have in Canada or the UK. People leave at 60 or 62. They go into the House of Lords. They serve on a commission. They become an ambassador. The labor movement in this country is so marginalized that these people don't want to leave the only positions that give them status and power and prestige and perks and so forth. Final point, salaries. I won't go into the gory details. They're in the book. This constellation of progressive unions, poor workers' unions, the people at the top are not poor. We're talking about people paying themselves $250,000, $350,000 a year to represent workers who make, what, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year. Brother Sal was one of the few people to challenge this trend in SEIU when he was on the executive board. He was an opponent of double dipping, where members of their executive board got paid for being members of the executive board and being local leaders. Very few other people supported him when he challenged that. This salary thing is part of what contributes to the great gap between the people at the top, the people at the bottom. The people at the top are insulated from what the people who pay the dues at the bottom experience every day at work. They have benefits that the members don't have. They have job security, unfortunately, that members don't have. You know, it is part of what contributes to these two different worldviews and the lack of sense of urgency, real urgency, about dealing with the crisis facing working class people in this country today. So I'm going to shut up so we can get into a good discussion. Thank you very much. And I recommend, for more information on all these topics that all four of us addressed, getting a copy of The Civil Wars in U.S. Labor. The sister here from Haymarket just happens to have copies in a pile up front. Only $17.
14 selling it.
14.